There's a lot of speculation that this process that y'all are going through these 2 weeks is really designed to shock, shock the voting public into realizing how just terrible things are and how deep those cuts would be, to give everybody some cover to come back and either raise the cigarette tax or raise fees to say, okay, if we don't do this, this is how just awful draconian it's gonna have to be. But instead, we could raise this $1 a pack, or we could raise this fee a little bit. I mean, is there any truth to that? Is that stuff, as I think Speaker Ralston said, still on the table?
Well, at this time, from the Senate perspective, we're not looking at any tax increases at all. We're looking at cuts. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily something that we're considering right now. But I will say this, that you can call it a shock factor or whatever, but I mean, the truth is the truth. And oftentimes, we are, when speaking to constituents, because they have their own lives outside of what we do here in government, thank goodness. And they don't, they hear these numbers, the state revenue's down 25%, but they don't really understand what that means. So I think the effort on behalf of legislators is to paint the picture of what this really means. Again, when you come into a budget downturn like this and you're already 49th or 50th in per capita spending, there's not a lot of fluff. I mean, Georgia is not a state where you could go out and find a lot of wasteful spending in your state government, particularly compared to other states. So we've hopefully cut that waste, and if there's more, we need to get rid of it. But by the same token, when you have this type of revenue downturn, you're talking about the core functions of government, public safety, education, healthcare, that absolutely will be impacted. And the public has a right to know what that impact will be.
How have the hearings gone from last week? I mean, have y'all gained anything from them so far? Do you know where you're going to look at making some of those cuts?
I think two things have really helped. Number one is that they've been joint hearings, so that what we've seen in the past is that the House will talk to a department and then the Senate will talk to the department, but the same story is not necessarily being told at the same time between the House and Senate. This has given us an opportunity with these joint hearings to have the department come before House and Senate. Same message, same story, everybody has everything on the table. I think that's been very beneficial. And there absolutely have been some savings found through this process, and we'll probably talk more about those next week. But are they the savings that are necessary to meet a $1 billion hole? I wouldn't think so. But again, this is not, we're not going to solve this problem with a $1 billion silver bullet. It's going to be solved with $10 million here, $25 million there, and cobbling all that together to save the $1 billion.
You talk about mass layoffs, and there's the other side of the argument that you lay off thousands of people, there aren't a lot of jobs for them to go to. Those are people not going to be spending money. They're not, maybe their home forecloses, then you lose out on property tax, and it's just a cycle. I mean, what do you think about that argument that, at some point y'all are going to have to realize that maybe tax hikes are in the picture?
Well, I think you make a very good point, and that is that there's only one way out of this. As we look the next 5 years to 10 years, the only way out of this is to grow the economy. So we have to ask ourselves, what policies can we put in place to grow the economy? What policies might we put in place that would further contract the economy? And we want to make sure we avoid any policies that would contract the economy and only support those that put us on a pro-growth model. So, people that are being laid off, I mean, absolutely nobody wants that. But the solution to that problem is creating a private sector environment that can hire those people. And that really is our challenge. You hear the comments so often that, well, if you'll just raise taxes. But that is just a short-term fix. The long-term fix, again, is growing the economy, and I don't think increasing the tax burden on Georgians helps that cause going long-term. So all legislators, but not just legislators, everybody in government, in these extremely difficult times, they need to make sure that they're making the decision for the long term, not for the short term, not just for the next election, but for the next decade.
Are the cuts to the regions, I mean, it seemed like kind of an earthquake in Georgia last week, and I guess we're all bracing for whatever list comes out this afternoon. Does that make it politically tougher to deal with cuts to higher education than other aspects of government?
That's a tough. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, but I will say is, again, as you look at that scale, those 31 departments, and it's ranged from about 3% being the smallest cut to 30% in the Department of Natural Resources, and this is over the last 2 years. The Regents is about at 13%, which puts them below the median department cut. So They have not been treated worse than the average department. In fact, they've probably been treated better with respect to funding. So, you know, would I love to stand before you and say, okay, no one's going to get cut, we're not going to touch education? I mean, I would love to say that, but that's irresponsible. And for those in elected office or those who are running for office who are making such statements, it's irresponsible as well. I mean, the voters expect one thing. They expect us to be honest with them. And when we walk around saying we're not going to touch this and not going to touch that, that's not necessarily being honest.
In terms of the layoffs, have there been any departments that is it too early to tell which departments are going to be hit the worst?
I think it's too early to tell, yeah. And remember, a lot of times it's not us being able to tell the department, you need to lay off these people. It's us saying, you're receiving a reduction in funding. You're going to have to make a decision on how you handle that. One of the potential answers to that, of course, is layoffs. So we have to look at every department and see what is it they're doing right now, how many people are eligible for early retirement in that particular department, and what is their core function. I mean, are they public safety, education, healthcare? And if they're not, you know, we really need to look at those other areas first.
Do you have a dollar amount for the early retirement?
No, I don't, sorry.
Well, the head of the retirement system said the other day that when y'all look at this a couple years ago, that moving it from 30 to 29 years would cost $63 million in just to the fund, which is,
Right.
I think, a drop in the bucket, I believe, isn't it, to the retirement fund? But
Yeah. Yes, I mean, there are answers out there. We have to answer the legal questions first, and then after answering the legal questions of how you might devise a plan to encourage people to retire early, then I think you get into the fiscal impact of what that plan looks like, so.
You may have touched on this with Aaron, and I know who I'm asking this question to, but is this the point where are you all looking at the hospital bed tax now as a possibility and/or the cigarette tax? I mean, are these two real possibilities now, considering the dire situation with the budget?
Well, I know that, of course, those two bills have to originate in the House, and I know that there are a lot of people suggesting that is one way out to raise those taxes. On the Senate side, we have not looked at those taxes. Our sole focus has been to make reductions, make reductions, make reductions. And I think as long as you have that lifesaver out there of just taxing people more, it really removes the pressure to make sure you're making the proper reductions. So we're going to continue along this policy of finding cuts and finding reductions and shrinking the state workforce and shrinking the size of government. And but we'll also continue to work with the House. I think they're philosophically with us, but I know those bills start over there, so they probably give them first consideration.
I'm a little confused about that point, which isn't surprising, but maybe you can help me. Is it $1 billion or $1.1 billion, whatever the number is that the budget deficit, assuming we don't do the hospital tax and we don't do GFA monetization, which is about $600 million, give or take?
Yeah.
Is that the way you understand it? Like, but if we did the hospital tax and the GFA, the cuts would only need to be another $400 million?
No, I think you have a lot of things at play here.
Yeah.
The $1 billion target is not something that we said, all right, absolutely it's $1 billion. I think it's a ballpark figure, and I'll tell you why. Because you have some legislative actions that would need to be taken. As opposed to the past when we just say, all right, we have a $1 billion shortfall, let's cut $1 billion. Now some of the remedies are legislative actions. The GFA securitization is one of them. Will that pass? Will that not pass? One of the biggest factors, of course, is growth. Do you believe Georgia's going to flatline next year? Do you believe we're going to grow by 4% as the governor has indicated in his budget? Do you cut that in the middle and say it's about 2%? We're kind of looking along the 2% path, so those numbers are built in there, which would be a few $100 million. So there's so many factors, but when you start kind of putting the puzzle together, everybody comes back to it's generally around $1 billion.